On May 8, 1781, the ground beneath the Florida coast violently shook as a massive explosion ripped through the morning sky. Inside the British Queen's Redoubt at Pensacola, over 100 veteran soldiers were vaporized in a single, catastrophic instant. Wood, stone, artillery pieces, and human remains rained down on the surrounding swamps. For months, the British Empire believed Pensacola was absolutely untouchable. It was their crown jewel in the south, an impenetrable fortress guarded by heavy cannons, treacherous underwater shoals, and seasoned British redcoats. They thought anyone foolish enough to attack it would be swallowed by the sea or slaughtered on the sandy beaches. But the man watching the fortress burn from the Spanish trenches was not a fool. He was a 34-year-old rogue commander named Bernardo de Gálvez, and he had just pulled off one of the most insane, perfectly executed tactical gambles in the history of 18th-century warfare. To get to this exact moment, he had to defy the elements, survive back-to-back hurricanes, fight off deadly diseases in the mosquito-infested mud, and commit an act of defiance that the entire Spanish Navy considered absolute suicide. So, how did a forgotten Spanish mastermind manage to crack open Britain's greatest southern stronghold, humiliate their elite naval commanders, and silently save George Washington's American Revolution from total collapse? To understand the magnitude of what happened that morning and why it changed history forever, you have to look at the terrifying reality of the American South in the late 1700s. By 1779, the American Revolution was suffocating. If you looked at a map of the southern colonies, the situation was not just bad. It was a complete nightmare. The British war machine had shifted south. They captured Savannah and were preparing to choke the life out of Charleston, taking thousands of American soldiers prisoner in a catastrophic defeat. General George Washington was running out of men, money, and time. But while Washington dodged British bayonets on the eastern seaboard, a silent, deadly war was brewing along the Gulf Coast. Britain held a massive trump card, the fortress of Pensacola. Sitting on the edge of the Florida Panhandle, Pensacola was the beating heart of British naval power in the Gulf of Mexico. From this deep, protected harbor, British warships controlled the vital trade routes. Even worse, they used it to funnel weapons and gunpowder to their Native American allies, paying them to terrorize the Southern American frontier. If the British kept Pensacola, they could build an unbreakable wall around the rebellion. They would squeeze Washington's ragged army from the north, the entire eastern coast, and the deep south all at the same time. The Continental Congress knew they were completely trapped. They had absolutely no navy to send and zero troops to spare. If someone did not destroy Pensacola, the American Revolution would be completely crushed forever. They desperately needed a miracle. And that miracle was about to come from a foreign empire that was not even fighting for American independence. Enter Bernardo de Gálvez, the Spanish governor of Louisiana. He was not your typical 18th-century aristocrat who sat in a velvet chair sipping fine wine while other men did the bleeding and dying. He was a young, brilliant military prodigy, aggressive, unpredictable, and completely ruthless when he needed to be. When Spain officially declared war against Britain in 1779, most European commanders would have spent many months writing letters, requesting supplies, and holding endless councils of war. Not Galvez. He understood a fundamental rule of combat that British generals consistently ignored: absolute speed kills. Before the British commanders even realized they were officially at war, Galvez launched a massive lightning strike up the Mississippi River. He marched a ragtag force through thick, mosquito-choked swamps and captured the British forts at Baton Rouge and Natchez. Then, he immediately pivoted, striking Mobile in early 1780. He hit them so fast and so hard that the British garrisons surrendered before London even knew they were under attack. But Galvez knew those quick victories were just the warm-up. The ultimate prize was always Pensacola, the absolute monster, the untouchable British command center of the entire South. Taking Pensacola was going to be a completely different nightmare. It required a massive naval fleet, thousands of hardened ground troops, and heavy siege artillery. The British were heavily dug in there. They had thick walls, hundreds of heavy cannons, and a deep water bay that was practically impossible to enter without getting blown to pieces. Galvez requested a massive armada from Havana, Cuba. He was finally ready to deliver the ultimate knockout punch to the British Empire. But he was about to discover that his deadliest enemy was not the British redcoats waiting for him. It was the dark, violent sky directly above his head. In October 1780, Galvez finally assembled his massive invasion fleet in Havana, Cuba. Dozens of heavily armed warships and transport vessels loaded with thousands of soldiers were ready to sail. He was coming for Pensacola. But the Gulf of Mexico had other plans. Just as the armada sailed into the open ocean, the sky turned a bruised, violent purple. The wind began to scream. A massive, catastrophic hurricane slammed directly into the Spanish fleet. This was not just a bad storm. It was an absolute monster that tore the ocean apart. Monstrous waves snapped wooden masts like dry twigs. Cannons broke loose and smashed through the hulls. Within hours, Galvez's entire invasion force was completely scattered, dismasted, or swallowed by the dark water. Ships were blown hundreds of miles off course, washing up as far away as Mexico. When news of the disaster reached Pensacola, the British commanders actually celebrated. They believed God himself had intervened to crush the Spanish threat. The British general, John Campbell, felt completely secure behind his massive fortress walls. He assumed the Spanish were totally broken and would never dare to return. Most generals would have surrendered to the elements. They would have written a polite letter of failure to the king and quietly retired. But Galvez was not most generals. He did not quit. Instead of accepting defeat, he marched right back into Havana, slammed his fist on the table, and immediately demanded a brand new fleet. By February 1781, Galvez achieved the impossible. Through sheer force of will, he rebuilt his entire invasion force and sailed back toward Florida. On March 9th, the massive Spanish armada finally appeared on the horizon right outside Pensacola. But arriving was only the first problem. Getting inside the bay was a completely different nightmare. Pensacola Bay was guarded by a deadly, invisible trap, a shallow underwater sandbar. And sitting directly above that sandbar were the massive, heavy cannons of the British fort on the cliffs. To get inside, the Spanish ships had to sail through a narrow, treacherous choke point at point-blank range while taking heavy artillery fire. The Spanish admiral, José Calvo, commanded the fleet. He was cautious, proud, and terrified of losing his ships. When his massive flagship, the San Ramon, attempted to cross the sandbar, the hull scraped the bottom. The ship violently shuddered and ran aground. Panic instantly swept through the Spanish Navy. Admiral Calvo quickly backed his ship out into the deep water and gave a shocking order. He refused to enter the bay. He claimed the channel was impossible to cross and that the British cannons would slaughter his entire fleet. Galvez was absolutely furious. His army was stuck outside the bay, completely exposed to the open ocean. If another sudden storm rolled in, they were all dead. Meanwhile, the British soldiers stood on their fortress walls, looking down at the paralyzed Spanish fleet, probably laughing at their cowardice. Admiral Calvo officially washed his hands of the operation. The Spanish Navy would not cross that sandbar. The invasion was effectively dead. Galvez realized that if this army was going to survive, he had to do something completely reckless, humiliating, and borderline suicidal. He would have to publicly shame an entire naval empire. Right now, the Spanish invasion was paralyzed. Thousands of soldiers sat on idle ships, watching their chance at victory slip away. Galvez knew that if he did not act immediately, the entire campaign would collapse in disgrace. So he did something that military historians still talk about today. He sent a small boat over to the cowardly Spanish admiral. Inside the boat was a solid iron cannonball recovered from the battlefield, along with a brutally insulting handwritten note. The message was simple. This cannonball was fired by the fort. Whoever has honor and courage, follow me. It was the ultimate 18th century flex. Galvez completely bypassed the naval command. He stepped off the flagship and boarded his own tiny personal ship, a small brig from Louisiana named the Yorktown. Compared to the massive British cannons waiting on the cliffs, this ship was nothing but a floating piece of firewood. Galvez ordered his men to raise the sails. He stood proudly on the wooden deck, hoisted his personal pennant flag high into the wind, and ordered his captain to sail directly into the deadly British choke point. Completely alone. As the tiny ship slowly approached the sandbar, the British gunners on the cliffs could not believe what they were seeing. Then, the British artillery opened fire. Massive iron cannonballs rained down from the sky. Heavy artillery shells smashed into the ocean, sending violent geysers of water crashing over the deck of the Yorktown. The noise was absolutely deafening. But Galvez never flinched. He stood his ground in the middle of the smoke and the crossfire, leading his tiny ship straight through the narrow, explosive gauntlet. Miraculously, he slipped across the sandbar and anchored safely inside the bay, entirely untouched. The rest of the Spanish Navy watched this spectacular suicide charge in absolute stunned silence. Deeply shamed by Galvez's unbelievable bravery, the rest of the naval captains finally found their courage. One by one, they raised their sails and followed him into the bay. Galvez was finally inside. The impossible naval blockade was officially broken. But the real, bloody nightmare on the ground was just about to begin. The Spanish fleet was finally inside the bay, but the hardest part of the invasion was just starting. To destroy the British stronghold, the Spanish army had to survive the Florida swamps. Galvez unloaded thousands of troops onto the beaches, and the glorious naval victory immediately turned into a brutal, filthy meat grinder. This was siege warfare. It was slow, agonizing, and incredibly deadly. To get close enough to blast the British walls, the Spanish soldiers had to dig a massive network of zigzagging trenches through the thick, mosquito-infested mud. They worked through the suffocating southern heat, standing waist-deep in dirty water. Disease started spreading through the camp faster than musket fire. Men collapsed from yellow fever, dysentery, and pure exhaustion. And the entire time they were digging, the British artillery never stopped firing. Massive iron cannonballs smashed into the Spanish trenches day and night, burying men alive under tons of wet earth. Shrapnel tore through the camp. The noise of the British heavy guns echoed across the swamp, denying the Spanish soldiers even a single hour of peaceful sleep. The danger was absolutely real. Even Galvez himself was not safe. While inspecting the front lines, a British bullet struck Galvez, wounding him in the stomach and the hand. Most commanders would have been evacuated to a hospital ship. Galvez wrapped his bleeding wounds, refused to leave the battlefield, and kept commanding his troops from a trench. Just as the Spanish army was reaching its absolute breaking point in the mud, a massive shadow appeared on the horizon. A combined French and Spanish reinforcement fleet arrived, bringing thousands of fresh troops and heavy siege cannons. With these new heavy guns locked securely into position, the deadly trap was perfectly set. The bloody climax of this brutal southern campaign was coming. But the British had a terrifying secret weapon hiding just outside the fortress walls. While the Spanish army focused all their attention on the heavy cannons in front of them, a completely different nightmare was hunting them from the dark woods. The British commander had heavily armed and paid hundreds of Native American warriors, primarily from the Choctaw and Creek nations. These indigenous fighters were absolute masters of the Florida wilderness. They did not fight in rigid, predictable lines like European soldiers. They moved like ghosts through the thick pine forests and brutal swamps. Suddenly, devastating hit-and-run attacks started striking the exposed Spanish flanks. Indigenous warriors ambushed Spanish foraging parties, vanished into the dense underbrush, and left absolute panic in their wake. They harassed the Spanish lines day and night, using psychological warfare to keep the invading army in a constant state of pure terror. Spanish soldiers digging in the trenches were completely exhausted. Now they had to constantly look over their shoulders, terrified that the next deadly strike would come from the shadows of the tree line. The swamp had become a deadly trap where danger lurked behind every single tree. Galvez quickly realized that his heavy siege cannons were totally useless against an invisible enemy hiding in the woods. He had to deploy his own light infantry and allied militia to fiercely protect his vulnerable flanks. The grueling trench warfare was suddenly surrounded by a brutal, invisible shadow war. And the British were preparing to exploit this chaos. The British commanders inside Pensacola were not just sitting behind their massive walls waiting to die. They were aggressive, seasoned veterans, and they saw a critical weakness in the exhausted Spanish lines. On the morning of May 4th, the British decided to stop defending and start killing. Hundreds of elite British redcoats suddenly burst out of the fortress gates and launched a devastating, lightning-fast surprise attack directly into the Spanish trenches. The exhausted Spanish soldiers, waist-deep in mud and looking out for Native American ambushes, were caught completely off guard. The trench fighting instantly turned into a savage, hand-to-hand bloodbath. British bayonets violently clashed against Spanish swords. Men gouged, kicked, and shot each other at point-blank range inside the narrow, muddy ditches. The air filled with thick black powder smoke and the desperate screams of dying men. The British soldiers successfully overran the advanced Spanish positions. They spiked several Spanish cannons, completely destroying the heavy artillery that Galvez desperately needed to win the siege. Then, just as quickly as they appeared, the British retreated back behind their impenetrable walls, leaving the Spanish trenches soaked in blood. Galvez watched his men dragging their dead friends out of the mud. The Spanish army was battered, bleeding, and rapidly losing morale. The siege was dragging on for weeks, and the British counterpunch proved they were still incredibly dangerous. The entire invasion was dangerously close to collapsing. Galvez needed an absolute miracle. And exactly 4 days later, the smoke-filled sky finally delivered it to him. May 8, 1781. The sun rose over the Florida swamps, baking the blood-soaked mud of the Spanish trenches. The brutal siege had dragged on for 2 agonizing months. Bernardo de Gálvez and his exhausted army were running out of time, supplies, and healthy men. Across the battlefield, the massive British fortress known as the Queen's Redoubt stood tall and defiant. The British soldiers inside were confident. They had survived the storms, repelled the trench attacks, and firmly believed their heavy stone walls would never fall. But war is completely unpredictable. Sometimes, the fate of an entire empire comes down to a single, chaotic fraction of a second. At exactly 9 in the morning, the Spanish artillery batteries opened up their daily bombardment. A Spanish gunner loaded a heavy howitzer, adjusted the angle, and fired a mortar shell high into the morning sky. Time seemed to slow down. The heavy iron shell traced a massive, arching, deadly curve through the humid air. It sailed clear over the thick defensive walls of the Queen's Redoubt. It bypassed the British cannons. It bypassed the defensive barriers. By an absolute miracle of battlefield geometry, the fiery shell dropped directly into the open door of the fortress's main gunpowder magazine. The British soldiers standing nearby probably only had a single heartbeat to realize what was about to happen. The explosion was apocalyptic. The ground violently shook for miles in every direction. A massive, blinding fireball erupted into the sky, instantly vaporizing over 100 veteran British soldiers. The deafening roar of the blast temporarily deafened men in the Spanish trenches hundreds of yards away. Thousands of pounds of solid brick, heavy timber, iron cannons, and human remains were blasted hundreds of feet into the air, raining down on the terrified survivors. The impregnable Queen's Redoubt was completely gone. In its place was a smoking, highly bloody, gaping crater. Galvez watched the massive plume of thick black smoke rise into the sky. He did not hesitate for a single second. Before the dirt even stopped falling from the sky, he drew his sword and ordered his elite light infantry to charge directly into the smoking ruins. The Spanish soldiers poured through the shattered British defenses. The unbreakable wall was finally broken. The unstoppable British Empire had just been cracked wide open. The terrified British garrison was suddenly plunged into absolute bloody chaos. The end was here. General John Campbell stared at the burning crater and realized it was completely over. On May 10, 1781, the British officially surrendered Pensacola. Over 1,000 elite British soldiers laid down their weapons. The invincible southern fortress now belonged to Spain. But the true impact of this massive explosion went far beyond the Florida swamps. It completely changed the destiny of the entire American Revolution. By capturing Pensacola, Bernardo de Gálvez instantly shattered the British war machine in the Deep South. The British permanently lost their most important naval base. They could no longer funnel weapons to their dangerous Native American allies. More importantly, British General Charles Cornwallis was suddenly cut off from vital southern reinforcements. While Cornwallis marched his army north toward a small Virginia town called Yorktown, he fully expected the British Navy to easily support him from the Gulf. He was dead wrong. Because Galvez had violently ripped the coast away from British control, the British military was severely weakened and deeply overextended. When George Washington and the French army finally trapped Cornwallis at Yorktown a few months later, Cornwallis had absolutely nowhere to run. His southern safety net was already gone. George Washington won all the historical glory at Yorktown. But the brutal, dirty work that made that legendary victory possible was done hundreds of miles away by a brave Spanish maverick in the muddy trenches of Florida. Without the fiery destruction of Pensacola, the unstoppable British Empire might have actually crushed the American rebellion forever. Bernardo de Gálvez never asked for American glory. Yet, George Washington personally acknowledged that Spain's aggressive Gulf Coast campaign was a deciding factor in winning the American Revolution. The King of Spain officially added the words, "Yo solo," I alone, to Galvez's family coat of arms, honoring his legendary suicide charge across the deadly Pensacola sandbar. Today, the coastal city of Galveston, Texas, proudly bears his name. But, in most American history textbooks, this brilliant military mastermind is completely forgotten. We easily remember the freezing snow of Valley Forge and the brilliant trap at Cowpens. But we forget the mosquito-choked trenches and the lucky mortar shell that blew Britain's southern strategy into a million pieces. If this untold story of tactical genius and sheer defiance changed how you view the American Revolution, please hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a comment below on which forgotten historical battle we should cover next.